entire family is dead, but the diabolically haunting story his murders inspired is very much alive. Generations remember the Amityville horror as the greatest ghost story of all time.
He fired 7 shots from a high-powered rifle.
In a matter of minutes, Ron DeFeo Jr. slaughtered his entire family as they slept. His mother, father, 2 sisters, and 2 brothers. After suggesting they were victims of a mob hit, DeFeo was offered police protection.
His alibis kept changing very, very quickly. The detective finally broke him. He said, it all happened so fast. Once it started, I just couldn't stop.
That prompted the late demonologist Lorraine Warren to claim
Ron DeFeo was demonically influenced and committing that crime.
There's one element in the usual mass murder story which seems to be missing from this case. There's no sense of fear in this community. No feeling of a mass murderer on the loose. People we talked to seem to feel that whatever was the motive for this crime, it had something to do with the family. It's not something that's going to return to bother anyone else. In Amityville, Long Island, Bill Barno, News Center 4.
Children, all are welcome, all welcome. Go into the night, there's peace and serenity in the light.
In 25 years of ministry, I have seen some interesting things. I have experienced some interesting things. By no stretch of the imagination would I consider my spiritual, paranormal, altered dimensional experiences to be tip of the spear. But they're enough to remind me that there is something out there beyond the light, living in the twilight, dwelling in the shadows. I've experienced enough to know that I don't want to experience the full measure of what lies beyond. We do live, I believe, in the twilight of our civilization. We live in a time when the darkness, when the shadow is becoming more and more prevalent. Down through the years, behind the scenes, with other men in ministry and other people in different aspects of, shall I say, dimensional encounters, we have often talked about those things that are there. You feel them behind you, and yet when you turn, you see nothing. You hear something, and yet there should be nothing there. Today, I want to share with you a few stories and ask you, what are these people experiencing? Have you experienced it? And do we really know what dwells within the shadows around us? The story says, I've seen and heard unexplainable things for many years. Mostly it happens in the few nights surrounding the full moon. I don't know why, the story says, but the subject of my post, though, begins a little over 2 years ago, when I was on my honeymoon. We were staying in a cabin, and one night by the fireplace, I began to see a black figure standing still, watching us. I was scared, but didn't mention it as we went to bed. Something kept me back. Something kept me from mentioning it. Now, I pause in this story because I think that may sound somewhat incredulous at the start. You might think, absolutely not. If I saw that, I would immediately, but would you? Those that have encountered the other side are often struck by 2 things. Number 1, paralysis. Not just a physical paralysis, but a paralysis of thought, and I would submit to you a paralysis of reality. Am I seeing what I'm really seeing? Am I hearing what I'm really hearing? The second thing is fear. If I am seeing what I'm really seeing, should I say anything? How do I describe it? What do I say? And what are people going to think of me? So it doesn't seem that far-fetched to me that someone would not necessarily immediately say something. They went to bed, and the story goes on, it was there next to the bed as soon as I laid down. Now, I actually told my husband that I was seeing it, and it was freaking me out. He did not see anything. Eventually, we went to sleep as best I could. So after the sun arose and I was in my right mind seemingly again, I chalked it up to being somewhat unstable. Somehow, something just wasn't clicking in my mind. After arriving home from our trip to the apartment we were newly living in, much to my horror, I began to see the shadow figure again, every night, in the spare bedroom, in the darkness through the slightly open door. I would try keeping the door closed, but somehow it was always open again. Although that could have been my husband's doing, I don't think so. I was afraid to say anything because I was convinced that saying it out loud would somehow either make me appear to be delusional or let the creature know that I was aware of it, and that would lead, somehow I felt, to an attack. It felt as if it wanted me to know that it was there, but it did not want anyone else to know that it was there. I started seeing it in our room, and when I saw it standing in the corner, even with the light on, while in an intimate moment, I finally had enough. I broke down and told him. I had a bit of a meltdown that night. I felt like I was going crazy, the article states, but he still couldn't see it and tried his best to comfort me as he could. After that, I didn't see it again for a long time, and I felt much better. In fact, I almost began to push it out of my mind. I figured my not wanting to say anything about it was probably the wrong decision, and I probably could have saved myself a lot of fear if I had been more open earlier. Well, I have now a returning problem. For the writer says, I have now again begun to see it lately, but only in the dark, and only when I'm alone. I know that the eyes can play tricks in the dark, and I'm not discounting the possibility that what I see and hear might be all in my head, that it's a psychological thing, a conjoining of shows that I've seen, movies I've watched, books I've read, experiences I've had, and a figment of my imagination running wild. But I don't think so. I don't feel that. I feel that it feels me. I'm far from understanding what's going on, but I fear that I am going deeper, the author says, into a madness. I went into my bedroom recently to get my computer. I could see my husband laying in his spot in the bed. We had been planning earlier to simply go to bed and rest, but I was surprised that he had stopped all that he was doing and was already in bed so early. I didn't mind, though. I was ready to crawl into bed and go to sleep, when it suddenly struck me that I had never seen my husband laying in bed at 9 o'clock without also looking at his phone. I had been in the bathroom, she said, getting ready, and I assumed that it was my husband that was laying in the bed. But now there was no phone light shining on his face. So I began to pull my phone out to shine my flashlight on him, and I heard a slight rustling sound coming from his direction. Just as I turned on my flashlight, nothing was there. Not even bedding in the shape of a person. Yes, it was dark, but there was a streetlight through the window, and I could clearly see his head with it until I turned my light on. Then suddenly I could hear him again downstairs. I heard my husband downstairs, even though what I saw clearly was a person laying in my bed. My immediate reaction was fear and trembling. I ran down the stairs to him as quickly as I could and saw my husband sitting on the couch, looking at his phone. I was worried, fretful, terrified, and as I tried to explain to him what I had experienced, he consoled me, but he could not see or understand what I had seen. I've done some research on incubi. Maybe I shouldn't have. Everything I've found out about the old beliefs only say that it approaches its victims while they sleep. Nothing like what I thought has happened to others. But still, I'm afraid to go to sleep, now at least by myself. I'm afraid to do anything by myself. The question is, does anybody I know, does anybody out there know what I am going through? Has anybody experienced what I have experienced? What did she experience? And what are people experiencing? There's another very similar story submitted, written by Shay from Merritt Island. We've lived in the house for a little over a year now. All of us have experienced multiple different things, but one thing in particular that only seems to happen to me is one that continues to freak me out and happens almost every night. My husband is a very deep sleeper, never moves around. Nothing ever wakes him up. I, on the other hand, am a restless sleeper and wake up frequently. Almost every night, sometimes even during the day, whether I'm alone in the house or not, when I lay in my bed, whether it's to sleep or just relax a bit, after a while, I randomly feel someone sit down on the end of the bed. Or I feel someone climbing up onto the bed as if to lay next to me. Sometimes if I'm trying to sleep, I'll sit up thinking it's my husband or one of our kids, but when I look, no one's there. Yet I legitimately felt someone or something on the bed. A few times I have even felt someone touching my leg or my arm, like someone's hand on me. Again, I'd think it's just my husband, but when I look, he's either passed out, not even facing me, or I'm in bed alone. Once it even felt like someone was pulling on my blanket. Other things have occurred in the house that have freaked me out. My kids, my brother, even my husband. Keep in mind, my husband does not believe in any of this quote-unquote psychic stuff. So I was in shock when he told me he had experienced something that freaked him out. So much, in fact, that he said he wants me to have someone cleanse and bless the house. I personally don't feel like it's anything harmful, maybe playful, maybe innocent. So I haven't had the house cleansed, but I would like to know who or what it is. What does lie beyond our sense? What does lie beyond the scope of our ability to perceive? I, for instance, know a preacher, a pastor who was out of the country for some time in island areas. He witnessed things that he was scared to even fully mention or describe. Shadow beings, shadow animals. So what are we talking about? Beings, yes. Spirits, certainly not human spirits. The Bible tells us where they go. To be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord, or, if unsaved, to be absent from the body is to be in hell instantly. But can there be residual negative energy, a sort of paranormal stain on the fabric of reality? Or are these incubi and succubi, are the little green men that are abducting people actually the prey, the demonic prey? Or the demonic predators, I should say, that prey upon us? What are these things, these beings in the shadows? I remember one particular person sharing with me about seeing something perch, a being that would perch on the end of the bed. What is happening in these places? What is happening in the fabric of our reality? One of the most fascinating studies that blurs the line of poltergeists and demonic activity, of psychic trauma and delusional irrationality, is the story of Amityville. Sean Castile writes, Amityville, the very name of the small Long Island, New York community, instantly conjures visions of horror, of a death-dealing psychopath laying waste to his parents, 2 sisters, and 2 brothers with a Marlin rifle. The egregious murders were chronicled in both a best-selling book and a major Hollywood studio movie, and have become, pardon the pun, quote, a household name, Castile writes, the Amityville Horror. The convicted killer was Ronald DeFeo, Jr., whom one judge called, quote, the devil incarnate. DeFeo told varying versions of what happened the night of November 13th, 1974, including the claim that he was possessed by an evil spirit and had committed the crime through no free will of his own. While it is, of course, impossible to decide the existence or non-existence of the devil and his demons in a court of law, the evil spirit possession argument was entered along with an insanity plea. Ultimately, DeFeo received a 25-year to life sentence for each of his victims and remains in prison today. But is it so easy to simply scoff at DeFeo's claim to have been an unwitting agent of the devil? Could it possibly be that DeFeo was telling the truth of what happened? This is one of the many issues dealt with in the book recently issued by Timothy Green Beckley's Inner Light publishing house entitled Amityville and Beyond, The Lore of the Poltergeist and Other Petrifying Paranormal Phenomenon. The book breaks relatively new ground in making some overdue correlations between spirit possession, ghosts, and even, as we have often said here, the UFO alien presence. It is the overarching theory of everything hypothesis that perhaps being credited originally to John Keel, whom we have discussed here on The Soul Trap, and was later expounded upon by the very prolific writer Brad Steiger. But Beckley and his hardworking crew of contributors aim to take this theory and definitely tie up the loose ends and connect it to the many forms of paranormal, para-UFO activity together. Paul Eno is among top-notch researchers Beckley has assembled for the writing. He says, quote, American history is full of poltergeists and nasty and vengeful spirits. Much has been written about the Bell Witch that frightened a U.S. president so badly that he fled in the early morning hours from a Tennessee homestead. Furthermore, this book contains the full story of the dreadful Amherst poltergeist, which is just as scary as any similar saga of evil you are likely to hear about from a historical perspective. Eno continues, my attitude about such cases is a bit more radical than the views of other researchers, who tend to treat such poltergeist outbreaks as either restless spirits gone awry or put them in the general category of purely psychological manifestations attributed to the witnesses. I see such outbreaks, he says, more akin to a crossing of a parallel dimension, something we've discussed here very often, by a variety of beings often being mistaken for the undead, though they seem to have in many instances the same attributes of the so-called aliens. How fascinating that is. Even cryptids from the darkest realms of our mind have recently been brought into the poltergeist equation. All of them, as we have said here at the Soul Trap for so long, there is a connection. In one of Eno's investigations, he talks about an event that took place. At another point during Eno's visits to the Bridgeport home, he was alone in the house with the Goodins, the owners of the home that were struggling, playing Monopoly with Marcia to pass the time and to help her relax. Suddenly, an acrid smell, like ozone mixed with sulfur, came from the kitchen. Instantly, Gerard Gooden was up, dashed into the kitchen, and started chanting in Latin. My skin tingled with an electric charge that I now associate with the electromagnetic reality physicists call branes, B-R-A-N-E-S, presumably the boundaries between the parallel worlds. A whitish, gauzy cloud began to form in the kitchen, Eno continues, and Gooden was back in the living room at once. I was convinced that 4 entities were arriving in the kitchen from Marcia's adjacent bedroom. They weren't entirely invisible, and there were 4 distinct shapes coming from the kitchen in a line. They were each about 4.5 feet high and had rounded tops with no discernible head or shoulders. Gooden saw the figures also, and he also followed one as it moved from the kitchen. As the mysterious entities entered the living room one by one, Laura Gooden started to cry while Marcia clung to Eno for comfort. Then one of the almost invisible beings approached Eno and stopped. That's when he said, I made my mistake. I began to feel angry towards this thing, which at the time I thought was demonic in classic theological sense. I was angry because it was obviously trying to get to this child, though whatever it was simply fed on the negative energy, and I was releasing it, and it grew stronger. What happened next, he said, was the biggest shock I'd experienced in any paranormal work up to that time. As the entity moved to get around me and at the girl, I instinctively pushed toward it. It resisted as though it was entirely material. In fact, I felt flesh and bone structure, as if this were a solid being. These, quote, demons were supposed to be spirits, but here it was, feeling as if it was flesh and blood. He goes on to recount the story and the harrowing experience of this poltergeist and their drama and trauma of trying to exorcise it from the house. Now, the fact of the matter is, there are stories after stories. He mentioned earlier Brad Steiger. You can read many of his stories and many of his encounters. There are encounters with poltergeists, clouds, ghosts, electromagnetic beings, and then the serpent people. The serpent people that Steiger believes are enacting on a daily basis at the highest levels of our government. And so, whether it be the Amityville horror, or whether it be other stories along the line, there have been this constant flow. Poltergeists, expressions, manifestations of these shadow beings come in all shapes and sizes and inspire varying degrees of horror. What might be surprising is that poltergeists are not necessarily the spirits of the dead, nor overworked, nor a result of disordered personalities of the living, often thought to have become possessed by demonic forces. That which we call a poltergeist, some are arguing, could simply include a wide range of unearthly phenomenon, such as beings interacting with our world from another dimension, or beings that are moving through our time-space dimension, or even cryptids, some kind of a non-biological entity that is yet natural, though not biological. It is always possible to come up with a different idea, a different concept, a different reality, and everybody is trying to figure out what it is. But in reality, it always comes down to this very simple thing. There is something there. Poltergeist, ghost, alien, demon, whatever you want to call it. There in the shadows, there are a variety of these, shall we say, expressions. Have you experienced an expression? Have you experienced an encounter? When the lights are off and you still see the shadows, the question we have been asking for 6,000 years is, who or what lurks in the shadows?
All right. First of all, the book and the movie depict all these kind of weird, strange things that happened in the house during those 28 days when you were there. What kind of things, George, happened physically? What were some of the things that happened that scared you?
Well, at first, just moving into the house was fine. It's a lovely house.
Yeah.
And we enjoyed moving in. Within a week, Kathy's hand had been touched by something that we discussed and couldn't explain. It was just something unseen. Within
this is in the daylight, or was it?
Yes,
It was during the day.
right.
Okay.
We also had hordes of flies that would appear within 2 rooms. And no matter how many times we would kill them, they would reappear.
All right, now flies can be a real problem in this part of the country in the summer,
Sure.
in any house, you know.
But if you have 2 or 3 or 4 within one room, that could be commonplace. But when you're talking over 100,
Well, this was the winter.
yes,
You're talking about how many?
over 100
Over
flies
100
at
flies.
one time, and then you'd go around and kill them. They'd be lying on the floor. You'd come back an hour later, and they would be there, more of them.
Okay, there's something about green slime. What was that? On the wall in the movie, this green slime comes out of the walls? Right? George, did that happen?
As the movie did it, not exactly, no.
Yeah.
It was more of a gelatin kind of substance that we thought the children had somehow mixed something up and spilled it around the house. The next time it happened, the kids were at school, and there was just no way to explain how it got there.
Did you all call, a contractor or a carpenter or anybody to come and look and try to?
We had several repairmen come in. Telephone repairmen came 3 times because each time we tried to communicate with the priests, we would run into faulty connections. We had extreme fluctuations in the heat, between 40 and 50 degree fluctuations. 3 times the serviceman came in. One time he was there, he heard the furnace functioning, and yet there was no heat within the house. The temperature was at 40, and yet the thermostat read 80.
Okay, no, but you had somebody inspect the entire heating system. Goodness knows those of us who live in the north know what can happen with heating systems in a house, especially old houses. George, there was also something about black in the toilets, the water black, and making the ceramic, the bowls or whatever black.
The china itself, it wasn't in the water. The china itself turned black, and at first it was one bathroom and then another and then another, so that by the time the investigators got there, a number of them was still black. It was still that way. There was never any reasonable explanation.
Did you have a plumber come in? I mean, when you first spotted
it, it wasn't a problem with the water. The water was clean. It was normal.
But did you invite any contractor, somebody like that, just to come say, hey, what's wrong with the toilets?
No, because
you didn't, yeah.
One of the things we found was the keyholes would ooze a black substance, which was of the same nature and appearance as that which was on the porcelain in the toilets. And when the investigative team came on March 6, 1976, the substance was still on the keyholes, and they were able to obtain samples of it because it was never in a moist condition. Right. And they wouldn't do physical damage to the door, in other words, carve out a piece of wood without our consent.
Had either of you had any experience before with the occult or the supernatural, ever before?
We didn't believe in it.
Were you afraid for your children? Why didn't you leave earlier than the 28 days if you were terrified?
Well, it was our house. First of all, we had never intended to give it up. Even after we moved out, we intended to find out what was wrong and move back in there. That's why the investigation was held, and people from different psychic research groups that at least we could check their credentials were called in and asked to come in. We've been asked many times why we stayed so long. It's very hard to remember the exact emotions or the moment why you would make a decision or why not.
But you finally did make it.
Well, by the time we left, we had lost a considerable amount of weight. Kathy was passing out quite regularly. I had lost over 26 pounds. And we were just reacting from one happening to another.
So you were generally shook up.
We weren't thinking, yes, as we normally would.
Gene?
The mysteries and controversies surrounding the Amityville story begin with the horrific events that took place on the night of November 13th, 1974, when 6 members of the DeFeo family, mother, father, and 4 children, were shot to death inside this house. New York TV station Channel 5 were determined to get the scoop.
I got in touch with George Lutz and said, your family needs help, because they were clearly terrified.
When the Lutz family claimed that their home in Amityville was possessed, a local TV station assembled a team of psychics and arranged to film their investigation of the house.
When we went up to the 2nd floor, of course the psychics could feel the remnants or the bad vibes. 6 people had been murdered violently there, not 2 years before. Again, as a reporter, I have to tell you, I did not see anything, I did not feel anything, other than the reaction of Ed, Lorraine, the other psychics, and the other people around me. At 2 in the morning, I remember Marvin Scott turning to me and saying, we don't have it. In other words, this was not The Exorcist for television.
Although nothing happened with the TV cameras, one photograph taken that night would later apparently reveal a mysterious presence.
The camera was set up in a tripod and it just automatically shot off a flash photograph every few moments. And there were rolls and rolls of film of this particular doorway that was into our daughter Missy's room. The photographs were being cataloged by a secretary I had years later in California. And she was pregnant. And every time she picked up this one particular picture, the baby inside her jumped.
And lo and behold, on the 2nd floor, in the doorway of one room, there is the distinct figure of a little boy peering out from the doorway. There were no children in the house that night. So it's like, okay, where did this come from?
When we called Missy and asked her, who was this? And she said, oh, that's the boy